Imagine being the absolute supreme ruler of one of the most powerful and wealthy nations on earth. You have massive, terrifying armies at your command and endless rivers of gold flowing into your treasury. But you spend every single day living in a state of pure, agonizing, and uncontrollable physical terror. You refuse to let anyone touch you, and you walk down the hallways as slowly as possible. Because you genuinely believe with your entire mind that your physical body is made of fragile glass. You are completely convinced that a simple hug or a sudden bump will shatter you into pieces. This sounds like a dark, twisted psychological horror movie, but it is a completely true historical event. Meet King Charles VI of France, the man who was completely terrified of his own furniture. He went from being the absolute beloved savior of his country to a walking, talking windowpane. This is the absurd, tragic, and deeply bizarre story of history's most fragile and mentally broken monarch. To truly understand the absolute madness of King Charles, we first have to look at his beginnings. He was not born a rambling madman hiding in the dark corners of a royal medieval palace. When he actually took the throne in the late 14th century, the people of France loved him. They proudly called him Charles the Beloved because he was incredibly handsome, energetic, and a brilliant leader. France was dealing with the endless nightmare of the 100 Years' War against the relentless English armies. The young king fired all of his corrupt, greedy uncles who had been stealing the national treasury. He replaced them with brilliant advisors and actually brought a rare period of peace to the kingdom. For the first 12 years of his reign, everything seemed absolutely perfect for the French royal family. He had a beautiful, powerful wife named Isabeau of Bavaria and the absolute loyalty of his subjects. But beneath that shiny royal surface, a terrifying genetic time bomb was slowly ticking inside his brain. His mother suffered from severe, terrifying mental illness, and that dark legacy was waiting for the king. Being a medieval king was not just about wearing a heavy gold crown and eating massive feasts. It was a nightmare of constant political backstabbing, assassination attempts, and the heavy burden of absolute power. By the time Charles reached his early 20s, the crushing weight of the crown began to show. He started suffering from mysterious raging fevers that would leave him completely bedridden for weeks at a time. His hair and nails would randomly fall out, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and deeply paranoid. In the year 1392, a trusted friend of the king was brutally assassinated. The killer fled to the region of Brittany, and King Charles demanded absolute, immediate, and bloody revenge. He gathered his royal army in the middle of a brutal, scorching hot summer to march west. His advisors begged him to wait, because his physical and mental health were already in rapid decline. But the king was absolutely obsessed with vengeance and ignored every single warning from his royal doctors. The breaking point finally happened in August as the army marched through the thick forest of Le Mans. The sun was absolutely blinding and the king was sweating heavily while acting incredibly strange and quiet. Suddenly, a crazy barefoot beggar dressed in rags jumped out from the trees and grabbed his horse. The wild man screamed directly into the king's face, warning him that he was surrounded by traitors. He shouted that the king was going to be betrayed and murdered by his own loyal men. The royal guards quickly beat the beggar and chased him away, but the psychological damage was done. The king sat on his horse, completely frozen in terror, staring deeply into the dark summer forest. A few minutes later, a sleepy young page accidentally dropped a heavy steel lance onto another helmet. The loud, sharp crashing sound of metal hitting metal echoed violently through the quiet, heavy summer air. King Charles completely snapped, and his mind broke into 1,000 unrecoverable and terrifying little pieces. When the king heard the metal crash, he drew his massive sword and screamed at the top of his lungs. He shouted that his enemies were finally attacking, and he charged directly at his own loyal knights. The king swung his heavy sword with absolute blind fury, hacking and slashing at everyone around him. His own brother, the Duke of Orleans, had to run for his life to escape the raging king. Before anyone could actually stop him, the king had brutally murdered 4 of his own loyal men. The knights were absolutely terrified because you cannot simply attack or kill a king chosen by God. It took a massive group of heavily armed soldiers to finally wrestle the screaming monarch to the ground. They tied him up and laid him in a cart, watching their glorious king foaming at the mouth. That horrific, blood-soaked day in the forest was the exact moment the golden era of France ended. The country suddenly realized that their beloved, strong king had completely and totally lost his mind. After the horrific forest incident, the king's mental state completely collapsed into a terrifying series of episodes. Sometimes he would wake up completely normal and apologize deeply for the terrible things he had done. But those moments of clarity became incredibly rare as a thick, dark fog took over his brain. He began to completely forget his own name and denied that he was ever the King of France. When his beautiful wife Isabeau came to comfort him, he would scream and ask who she was. He demanded that the guards remove the strange, terrifying woman from his private royal bedroom immediately. He ordered his servants to destroy all the royal crests and family symbols painted around the palace. Sometimes the royal guards would find him running wildly on all fours through the dark castle hallways. He would howl loudly at the moon, completely convinced that he was actually a wild, hungry wolf. But his most famous and absolutely bizarre obsession was about to emerge from the depths of his madness. King Charles developed a paralyzing, uncontrollable fear that his entire physical body was made of thin glass. This specific psychological condition actually became known to modern medical history as the glass delusion. You have to remember that in the 14th century, clear glass was a relatively new and magical material. It was incredibly expensive, beautiful, and most importantly, it was exceptionally fragile and easy to destroy. The king's fragile, shattered mind projected his mental vulnerability onto his actual physical human body. He completely banned anyone in the entire royal court from touching him or even standing too close. If a servant had to hand him a simple cup of water, they had to do it with extreme caution. He would scream in absolute terror if a door slammed too hard, thinking the vibration would shatter him. To protect his fragile glass body, he ordered his royal tailors to design incredibly bizarre custom clothing. He forced them to sew thick, heavy iron rods directly inside his shirts and his velvet jackets. He effectively walked around his own castle wearing a hidden iron cage just to keep himself from breaking. He completely refused to sit down on any hard wooden chairs or benches anywhere in the palace. He was absolutely terrified that if he sat down too hard, his glass bottom would shatter into pieces. Imagine trying to run an entire powerful country when you are literally too scared to sit on a throne. When the most powerful man in the country thinks he is a windowpane, you have a massive problem. The royal court desperately brought in the greatest medical minds of the 14th century to cure him. But you have to remember that medieval medicine was basically just a chaotic mixture of guesswork and torture. The doctors genuinely believed the king's madness was caused by a dangerous imbalance of his bodily humors. They tried aggressively bleeding the king by attaching dozens of hungry leeches to his fragile royal body. When that completely failed, they forced him to drink incredibly toxic potions made of crushed pearls and gold. Some doctors believed he was possessed by evil demonic spirits, so they performed endless, exhausting religious exorcisms. They even brought in local sorcerers and magicians who promised to cure the king with dark magic spells. One physician even suggested drilling a literal hole into the king's skull to let the evil vapors escape. Absolutely none of these terrifying treatments worked, and the king's mental state only continued to decline rapidly. The royal court was completely paralyzed because nobody knew how to handle a ruler made of glass. While the king was busy hiding in his bedroom wrapped in thick blankets, the country was falling apart. France was a massive, complicated machine that absolutely required a strong and ruthless king to keep it running. With Charles completely out of his mind, the power vacuum attracted the most dangerous political vultures in Europe. His ambitious brother, the Duke of Orleans, and his powerful cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, began fighting bitterly. They constantly manipulated the fragile king whenever he had a rare, fleeting moment of total mental clarity. They would trick him into signing massive tax laws or giving away vast territories to their loyal supporters. The Queen Isabeau was caught right in the middle, trying desperately to hold the fractured kingdom together. She had to basically run the country while dealing with a husband who thought she was a dangerous stranger. The tension between the rival dukes eventually exploded into a massive, bloody, and devastating French civil war. The kingdom was shattering into a million pieces, exactly like the glass body the king hallucinated. If you thought the situation could not possibly get any worse, you are completely and totally wrong. In January of 1393, the royal court decided to throw a massive wild party. They wanted to cheer up the depressed king and celebrate the recent wedding of a royal lady-in-waiting. They organized a wild masquerade ball that would forever be known as the Dance of the Burning Men. King Charles and 5 of his closest noble friends decided to dress up as wild, mythical forest creatures. Their bizarre costumes were made of highly flammable linen, completely soaked in hot, sticky pine resin. They covered the sticky resin with thick, raw flax to make themselves look like hairy wild beasts. They chained themselves together and ran into the center of the dark, crowded ballroom to dance wildly. Because the costumes were basically giant walking matchsticks, there was a strict rule against bringing any torches. They specifically ordered that all candles and torches must be kept far away from the dance floor. But the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, had been drinking heavily and completely ignored the strict rules. He walked right up to the chained dancers holding a blazing torch to try and guess their identities. The Duke held the blazing torch far too close to the highly flammable costumes of the wild men. A single tiny spark fell from the torch and landed directly on one of the sticky resin costumes. Within absolute seconds, the 5 chained men erupted into a massive, terrifying pillar of screaming, roaring fire. The party guests watched in absolute frozen horror as the highest nobles in France burned alive. The men were chained together so they could not escape the intense heat of the massive, roaring inferno. The ballroom turned into a nightmare of screaming, panicked nobles crashing into each other trying to flee. King Charles was incredibly lucky because a brave teenage duchess realized exactly who he was. She bravely threw her massive, heavy velvet skirt completely over the king to smother the growing flames. 4 of his closest friends burned to death right in front of his eyes in the most agonizing way possible. The smell of burning flesh and the horrific screams echoed through the royal palace for days. After watching his friends turn to ash, the king's incredibly fragile mind was completely and permanently destroyed. The trauma of the blazing inferno erased any tiny remaining shred of sanity left in the king's mind. He retreated into the darkest corners of the palace and completely gave up on reality and his kingdom. His fear of shattering became so extreme that he refused to change his clothes or even bathe himself. He went for 5 entire months without washing his body or letting anyone clean his royal bedchamber. The smell became so incredibly toxic and overwhelming that his servants could barely enter the dark room. When they finally forced him to bathe, they had to hire a group of strong men disguised in masks. They ambushed the terrified Glass King in the dark and forced him into a tub of warm water. He screamed in absolute agony, convinced that his fragile glass skin was cracking under their heavy hands. The once handsome and glorious Charles the Beloved had become a terrifying, filthy ghost haunting his own castle. He was completely abandoned by his political allies, who were too busy fighting over his broken kingdom. While France was destroying itself from the inside, the English were watching the chaos with greedy eyes. King Henry V of England saw the perfect opportunity to strike a fatal blow to his ancient enemy. He launched a massive invasion of France, knowing that the French military was completely divided and leaderless. In 1415, the English army absolutely slaughtered the French nobility at the Battle of Agincourt. It was one of the most devastating and humiliating military defeats in the entire history of the French nation. King Charles was completely oblivious to the fact that his kingdom was being violently ripped apart by invaders. 5 years later, the English forced the completely broken and confused Glass King to sign the Treaty of Troyes. In a moment of pure madness, he officially disinherited his own son from the royal line of succession. He declared that the King of England would inherit the throne of France after his ultimate death. The fragile king had successfully handed over his entire empire to his worst enemy with a single signature. King Charles VI finally died in October of 1422 after 30 years of madness. His death was not a grand, glorious royal event, but rather a quiet, pathetic end to a miserable life. He was largely ignored in his final days, completely consumed by his terrifying delusions of fragile glass. His legacy is one of the most tragic and fascinating psychological case studies in all of recorded history. He was a man who possessed absolute total power over millions of people and vast territories of land. But he was completely and totally trapped inside the terrifying, invisible prison of his own broken mind. His tragic reign proves that no amount of gold, armies, or royal blood can protect you from mental illness. The king who thought he was made of glass ultimately watched his entire kingdom shatter into pieces. If you loved this wild dive into the weirdest and darkest corners of royal history, hit that subscribe button. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think was the absolute craziest part of this true story.